Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. And thank you very much for the invitation to take part today. I was able to join some of the earlier sessions and it seems to have been a really, really interesting day. Russia's treatment of international correspondence is the story of its relations with the West. The arrival in Russia of the coronavirus has highlighted some very interesting points about the capability which the Kremlin has to control the foreign press and the limit of that capability. Now, I'm going to talk mostly today about international media, but I want to make special mention before I do that of the many talented, dedicated and courageous journalists who've come from Russia and who, in the current political climate in particular, often work in very difficult circumstances. And I think, members of the audience will know the recent changes at Vedomosti are just one recent example, and the deaths of investigative reporters over the years are reminders of some of the dangers of working in the former Soviet Union. But I'm going to argue today that Russia's political leaders currently are very confident on the international stage, even if, like elites the world over, they're struggling to cope with the health, economic and political consequences of the pandemic. But they increasingly want to tell the story themselves rather than try to influence the way that it's told. But they realise that there are limits as to how much they can do that. But I want to make my argument by putting the situation today into some historical context. I've just published a book on the way that Russia's been reported in the West over the last 100 years. So I'm not going to give you a whole massive long history lesson, but I am going to go back and start very briefly in 1917 with the first of the two revolutions that shook Russia that year, because there's a very interesting moment there about political communication and the way that journalism then could be controlled. And the reason I say that was because when the Tsar, the Russian emperor, was first taken from power, when he first abdicated, the new government, the provisional government, managed to keep that from the world. They closed off the telegraph, and in those days, closing off the telegraph links to the rest of the world was a very efficient way of making sure that no news got out. In my recent research, I discovered a really interesting article from the Daily Mail, which pretty much goes against everything I try to tell my journalism students, because the headline was "No News from Russia." Now, of course, the fact that there was no news was significant. Everybody guessed that something was up. But the point was that then by cutting off the telegraph, the government could cut the entire country off from the world. Impossible to imagine nowadays, but a time when the government, the political power, could be completely in charge of what was going on. As I say, that was something which had the Daily Mail's editors fretting, but as they waited for news. Now, the whole of the Soviet period from 1917 until the Soviet Union ended in 1991, there were a variety of approaches which were used to control the international media. Firstly, as some people may well know, there was a different system if the correspondent was either from a communist country or from a communist media. In other words, so publications like the Morning Star or the Daily Worker or the Tribune in Canada, the correspondents there did not deal directly with the foreign ministry as correspondents do now, but they actually had a handler or a contact in the Central Committee of the Communist Party. So that was one way, and if those more favoured correspondents were often in some ways given better access. There are also times of relative openness. If you think about, this is quite hard to imagine in Russia now, but the General Secretary in the 1950s, Nikita Khrushchev, actually would go to diplomatic cocktail parties. So if the embassies of all the different countries around the world would have their national day, the United States Embassy would obviously celebrate the 4th of July. He would go along and chat to correspondents. There's lots of accounts of these in people's memoirs. But I was also interviewed one man who's very sadly since he died late last year, Robert Elphick, who was a correspondent for Reuters there in the 1950s. And he said that Khrushchev would come along because they were very keen to engage with the Western media, because getting quoted in the international media was also a means of getting political kudos at home. So we saw something similar during the perestroika and glasnost reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev in the 1980s. But there have also been times of a lot of suspicion of espionage, of correspondents being suspected of being spies, quite rightly on some occasions, by the way, and also of correspondents being spied upon. Correspondents have been expelled on at least one occasion. They've even been detained as it turned out, for exchange with people detained in the West. There are also times of severe limits on press freedom right throughout the Soviet period. And I think perhaps the most extreme of those were times of famine in Ukraine in the 1930s, and also during World War II, when there were a few correspondents were permitted to be in Moscow, but most of them were kept there and not allowed to travel around, apart from when the Soviet authorities wanted to show when they'd scored a great victory, particularly the Battle of Stalingrad. That all changed, and I think this is possibly one of the most interesting moments in Russian journalistic history, which still reverberates today, was in the 1990s. The end of the Soviet period saw a real flourishing of the freedom of the press, and I'm going to argue that the wars in Chechnya, I think, of which there were two in the 1990s, one from late 1994 broadly to 1996, and again from 1999 to 2000. I think those two conflicts were key events because of what they said about press freedom, and also I think they also set some of these, paved the way for some of the situation which we find today. If you talk to correspondents who covered that first war in 1994 to 1996, just for people who don't remember, Chechnya, which is the southern part of the southern region of the Russian Federation, fought these two separatist conflicts for independence from Moscow in the mid and late 1990s. It was an extremely it was a conflict in which many people lost their lives. The estimates are imprecise, but tens of thousands of civilians, it is generally agreed, along with a lot of conscript Russian soldiers who were ill prepared for the battle which they were being sent to. From a media point of view, perhaps the most interesting thing about the way that this conflict was covered was the total freedom that media were given, Russian media and also international media. You talk to international correspondents from that time, they will often use the phrase "a free for all." In fact, the only restriction really on journalists then was their own sense of danger, and how, because a number of journalists inevitably were killed in that conflict, and it was extremely dangerous. But a lot of and I think there are two reasons for this. Firstly, because of the chaotic nature of the conflict. The Russian government at the time, under Boris Yeltsin, the defense minister, had confidently said that they could take control of the main city there, Grozny, within 2 hours. That turned out to be very far from the case. And so there was a lot of danger there. But there was also, in the government at the time, I think there was a genuine commitment to press freedom. And it was an understanding that we might not like all the reporting that we're getting, but I think there was an understanding then that this was something that was part of Russia's drive then to form itself as a democracy after the decades of Marxism, Leninism. Now, I was among the correspondents who covered that conflict, and certainly it was extremely dangerous. But there was a sense that a lot of activity of normal free reporting was largely tolerated. Now, what happened between 1995 and 1999 was that Yeltsin left power and Vladimir Putin's rise to prominence began. I think I'm right in saying it was 21 years ago this month that he first became Russian Prime Minister, and then eventually acting president, and then eventually president. So Putin, I think, and the way that he, this was a man who was barely known in the summer of 1999, and yet in the spring of 2000, he was elected president. And one way he did that was by getting tough in the wars in Chechnya. And one way that Russia also did that was by placing much greater controls on the press. And I would argue that this was the beginning of an attempt to place greater controls on the press overall. Russia did not like the reporting of civilian casualties which resulted from that earlier conflict, and was determined not to see that repeated. So we have seen over the last few years a steady move, and I think there's also been a change of tactics as well. Because when Putin first came to be president, and his first term as president, there were echoes of that approach pioneered by Khrushchev, which was that if you engage with the international media, and also by Gorbachev, if you engage with the international media, you will get kudos at home, and people will see, well, look, you know, this guy is being, our president is being interviewed by the BBC, by the Financial Times, whoever else, so he must be pretty important. We're being taken seriously all around the world. However, of course, so that was the first to start with. There was that engagement, and that was a way of taking back, attempting to get more favourable coverage. The oil prices, as everyone knows, in Russia were rising significantly then. At least some of that money was spent. One source told me he estimated about $1 million a month was being spent on Western public relations advisors in 2006, 2007, when they signed contracts with those Western agencies to try to improve the international media coverage for Russia. Of course, since then, relations have soured significantly. I want to mention a couple more incidents which I think show the way that that has happened. Firstly, there was the war in August 2008 with Georgia over the breakaway territory of South Ossetia. I think there was a sense then, and I was a correspondent in Moscow at the time, that Russia did not feel it was getting fair coverage. But it's also interesting to note that RT, which started then, although it was still called Russia Today, did not get anything like the access that the international media did. For example, the BBC, CNN and Sky were given interviews with the Russian foreign minister as that conflict got underway. And RT were not given anything. In fact, they were reduced to asking to rebroadcast some of the interviews given to the Western media. That's a situation which I think is probably all but impossible to imagine today. It might be much more likely, for example, that RT would get the exclusive and everyone have to use their material. So South Ossetia, I think, was one moment, and then, but there was still this attempt to engage with the Western media, whether it was through PRs or directly. But I think that era is really over. And if we think about disagreements that followed over that war in South Ossetia, disagreements over Crimea, of course, most particularly, and also Syria, not to mention the poisoning of the Skripals in Salisbury in 2018, have strained ties to the extent that I think there's no sign at the moment that things will improve. And Russia now prefers very much to tell its own story through RT, through social media, etc. And Moscow correspondents, one of the ones to whom I spoke, Matthew Chance of CNN, for my recent research, says that they increasingly feel as if they're treated as hostile actors, a very difficult situation for them to be in. There's another story I heard from a correspondent who wanted to remain nameless about when they'd done a story about the Second World War, which involved them getting a WhatsApp message quoting articles from the Russian criminal statutes from the Russian criminal code. In other words, the warning was, you know, you're stepping a bit close to the line of things that we don't consider acceptable in the way that World War II is discussed. That, of course, has been a major article of faith right throughout the last century, the last half of the last century, celebrating the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany. But it's also become a very important part of the current Russian leadership's attempts to build up the image of modern Russia that it was. So to conclude, the Russian leadership wants to control the narratives of their domestic and international policies, and the pandemic in Russia, as in many other places, has given them the opportunity to try to do that to an even greater extent. They're generally trying to keep Western correspondents at a distance. And of course, there are valid health reasons for imposing new controls on travel, but such restrictions also have the happy side effects for governments, which don't want reporters asking too many questions. So for all the discussion about how much Russia controls its narrative and the way it's able to control that narrative on social media openly and less openly, reporting does still make a difference. And I think there's one big example of that back in May. The angry reaction to reports in the Financial Times and New York Times in that month, which suggested that the real figures for coronavirus infections in Russia were much higher than the ones which were being made officially public. And the reaction showed that the Russian authorities cared very much about the way the country was reported, and that international media still were influential. And then, of course, the Sputnik vaccine, which we read about last week. And I don't know if I'm the only one who's seen this, reports earlier today saying that a possible vaccine for cats that may be being developed in Russia as well, although I gather that was probably more developed for mink farms, which is a very important part of the fur industry. But that will no doubt generate plenty of interest too. But for all that Russia can be a difficult and demanding country to cover, I will conclude by arguing that Russian and international journalists still produce some absolutely first-rate reporting despite all those obstacles.